Anime, as a medium, is broad and imaginative, capable of exploring genres and emotions rarely seen in Western animation. It can be poignant, surreal, tender, even profound. And then there is Junju Romantica, a series that attempts to deliver all of that while also force-feeding us a relationship dynamic that makes even the most soap operatic telenovela seem restrained. The show follows three interwoven love stories between men. The central couple is Misaki, a bewildered teenage boy, and Yuomi, a 28-year-old best-selling novelist who is essentially a parody of every misunderstood, brooding, wealthy romantic hero rolled into one. Their relationship begins under questionable circumstances. Yuomi was originally in love with Misaki's older brother and quickly progresses to forced kisses, lingering stares, and the kind of sexual tension that teeters dangerously on the edge of coercion. The second couple is Hiroki and Naoki, a classic case of opposites attract. Hiroki is a high-strung, Sunday literature professor with a heart buried under 10 layers of unresolved academic angst. Naoki is younger, cheerful, and tenacious in his pursuit of Hiroki's affection. Of the three stories, this one is perhaps the most endearing, if also the most emotionally exhausting. Hiroki's constant inner turmoil plays like a melodramatic aria, but at least Naoki, unlike Uomi, tends to ask before initiating grand romantic gestures. There is a tenderness here that peeks through, even when the writing feels like it's been cribbed from a fanfiction forum. The third pairing, Miyogi and Shinobu, is perhaps the most eyebrow-raising. Miyogi is a middle-aged divorce and Shinobu is his much younger ex-brother-in-law who proclaims his love with the boldness of a character from a Shakespearean comedy, if Shakespeare had leaned harder into questionable age gaps. Their dynamic is the least fleshed out and often the most uncomfortable, relying on Shinobu's relentless declarations and Miyogi's emotional whiplash to carry the arc. The show insists this is romantic. I remained unconvinced. Let me be honest. If you strip away the genre's glossy exterior, what you're left with is not so much a story about romance as a story about emotional manipulation dressed up in sparkles and violin strings. Misaki spends most of the series either yelling in protest or looking confused while Yuomi barrels through personal boundaries like a tank made of roses and libido. The animation is passable, if uninspired. Characters tend to have two settings, flushed and not flushed. The backgrounds are bland. The comedic timing is more often frantic than funny. But I suspect none of that is why people watch this show. Junju Romantica is not about visual beauty or narrative finesse, it's about the idea of intense, impossible love, and perhaps that is its strange appeal. Underneath the manipulative framing and the uncomfortable age and power dynamics, there is a yearning that feels real. These characters, as ill-developed and melodramatic as they are, want to be loved. They want to be seen, held, desired. That basic human need peeks through now and then, like a sliver of sincerity in an otherwise overwrought production. But sincerity alone does not redeem a story so fraught with problematic tropes and clumsy storytelling. Love should not look like intimidation. Consent should not be a punchline. And yearning should not come at the cost of a character's agency. In the end, Junju Romantica is a curiosity. It has a certain cult appeal, especially among fans hungry for representation in a genre that too often shies away from openly queer relationships. But I cannot in good conscience call it a good show. It's a fantasy, yes, but one that too often confuses possessiveness for passion and silence for submission. Perhaps one day, we will get a version of this story that understands love as something more than blushing and power plays. Until then, Junju Romantica remains an awkward, melodramatic footnote in the evolution of queer anime storytelling. If Love Stage were a dish, it would be a whipped cream sundae served in a novelty dog bowl, sweet, frothy, unlikely to give you a toothache, but still oddly endearing if you're into that kind of thing. This 10-episode Yaoi anime, based on the manga by Aiki and Toshizayu, markets itself as a romantic comedy. In reality, it's a bizarre mix of gender confusion, forced kisses, and the kind of obsessive love that makes Twilight look like a pamphlet on healthy boundaries. Let's begin with the premise. Izumi Sina is a college student and aspiring manga artist who comes from a glittering showbiz family but wants nothing to do with the spotlight. Ryuma Ichiju is a rising young actor who falls in love with Izumi despite initially believing Izumi is a woman. When Ryuma discovers Izumi is actually a man, he has a short existential crisis, and then in a plot twist that feels like it was written by a very excitable teenage fangirl decides he doesn't care because love is love and Izumi is cute. At this point, you might think, okay, maybe we're headed into a touching, if trope-laden, story about sexual identity, fame, and acceptance. Unfortunately, Love Stage opts instead for melodrama, dubious consent, and more sparkly eyes than a Lisa Frank folder left in the sun. There is an earnest sweetness beneath all the chaos. Izumi, the reluctant protagonist, is actually a rather charming lead, more interested in drawing his magical girl manga than navigating his confusing relationship with a stubborn celebrity who can't take no for an answer. Ryuma, on the other hand, swings between devoted romantic and borderline stalker with alarming ease. There's a scene involving a forced kiss and groping that plays like romantic foreplay, but feels more like a script note from the Department of Bad Ideas. The show does attempt to pivot. Ryuma apologizes. Boundaries are discussed sort of. But the damage is done. A relationship that could have been about mutual emotional growth gets buried under a mountain of cliché, miscommunication, and glossy-haired assault. Now, I've long maintained that all stories deserve their place, and that animation, like any art form, should be allowed to explore sexuality, queerness, and relationships of all kinds. But Love Stage isn't really interested in nuance. It's more concerned with glittering eyes, shirtless onks, and the fantasy of love triumphing over reality, even when reality should probably be saying, hey, maybe slow down and respect personal boundaries first. The animation is standard late 2010s fair, clean, colorful, and occasionally charming in its silliness. The supporting cast includes a flamboyant older brother, a manager who seems to be in his own fanfiction, and a few side characters who exist mostly to deliver exposition or gasp in melodrama, and yet somehow Love Stage is not without a kind of hypnotic watchability. Maybe it's the sheer audacity of it all. Maybe it's the earnest belief that a love built on a childhood commercial can bloom into something real. Or maybe it's just so drenched in fan service that it becomes a genre unto itself, flawed, problematic, and weirdly compelling. If you're a teenage boy-loving romantic with a very high tolerance for questionable tropes and glittering nonsense, you might fall under Love Stage spell. Everyone else? Maybe stick with Given. Bottom line. Love Stage is a campy, chaotic rollercoaster with more red flags than a communist parade, but I suppose, in its own twisted way, that's part of its charm. There was a time when anime flirted with mainstream Western popularity by offering something dazzlingly different: emotional intensity, offbeat storytelling, and a bold refusal to sanitize its characters. Gravitation, in many ways, was one of the first yaoi-adjacent series to flirt with such crossover appeal. And for a time, it worked. It charmed. It thrilled. It even promised us something rare. Honest, gritty realism wrapped in pink-haired pop music chaos. It asked viewers to engage with queerness, heartbreak, and creative ambition all at once. And it did so with a manic confidence that felt intoxicating. The early episodes of Gravitation are an unusual mix of flamboyant energy and subtle emotional honesty. Shuichi Shindu, a manic, love-struck singer chasing dreams of stardom, meets Airi Yuki, a cold, enigmatic novelist with a past as guarded as his facial expressions. Their dynamic works because underneath all the sugar rush pacing, absurd gags, and bursts of synth pop, there's a persistent emotional ache. Yuki is clearly broken, and Shuichi, for all his chaos and comic relief, is trying to reach into that darkness with pure, unfiltered love. There's something raw in their growing bond, something brave in the idea that love, even queer love in a hostile world, might be redemptive. When the series dares to slow down, to breathe, to let Airi's trauma unfold through his brittle detachment and slowly thawing heart, it brushes greatness. It becomes not just a romance but a story about emotional survival, about learning to trust and be vulnerable again after deep hurt. The stakes aren't just whether Shichi's band gets a record deal, but whether Airi Yuki, shattered by his past, can believe in love again. And then the anime, like a producer who doesn't trust the audience, decides that realism is too difficult. Or worse, too boring. Instead of exploring Yuki's backstory with the nuance it cries out for, the show makes a confounding leap into the realm of pulpy melodrama. Suddenly, we are told Yuki had a bisexual affair with an older author as a teenager. A ripe, psychologically fascinating thread to pull. The kind of plotline that, if handled with emotional precision and maturity, could have deepened Airi's character and resonated powerfully with anyone who's ever lived through grooming, manipulation, or complex trauma. But no, we aren't allowed the complexity. Instead, it is reduced to a lurid footnote in a bizarre and rushed backstory. The show sensationalizes it, and then throws in a violent twist so jarring it borders on grotesque. The mentor sends thugs to rape him, and Yuki shoots them all, off-screen, with a gun. It's cartoonish, emotionally incoherent, and completely undermines the realism the series once strived for. This isn't raw storytelling, it's exploitation masquerading as drama. It's a plot device so mishandled it makes you question whether the show ever intended to treat trauma seriously in the first place. What could have been a powerful exploration of identity, pain, and the long journey toward healing becomes a distasteful, cheap shock, not earned, not handled with care, just flung in like bad tabloid TV. And then the show has the audacity to carry on as if nothing happened. As if this wasn't a turning point for every character and theme. No reckoning, no reflection. Just a hard cut back to business as usual, as if the entire emotional weight of that experience could be shrugged off with a commercial break. This is not storytelling, it is narrative cowardice dressed up as edginess. It's a betrayal of its characters and audience alike. Worse still, the anime tries to resume its former romantic charm afterward, as though nothing truly happened. It gaslights its own audience. Irie and Shichi's relationship never reckons with that trauma meaningfully. Shichi's love feels unmoored, too unconditional for someone we just saw thrown into the narrative equivalent of a psychological war zone. Irie's trauma remains unresolved, treated as background noise instead of the defining wound it clearly is. And yet, I must say this, there are fragments of brilliance in Gravitation. The music is energetic, the animation is expressive and occasionally bold in its direction. The first half is genuinely engaging. The chemistry between the leads is palpable, chaotic, and for a while tenderly rendered. When it leans into the absurdity of young love and the awkward dance of intimacy, it works. Shichi's devotion, his wide-eyed faith in Yuki, is not just adorable, it's moving. And when the series takes these emotions seriously, even for a few moments, it brushes something real and beautiful. But like too many shows that brush against truth, Gravitation flinches. It pulls back just when it could have matured. Instead of confronting the abyss, it throws glitter on it and hopes we don't look too closely. It wants to be both light and heavy, goofy and gritty, without ever putting in the work to reconcile those extremes. In the end, it becomes a show at war with itself, afraid of its own potential, sabotaging its best instincts. There is a scene in Given, the 2019 anime series about 4 young musicians navigating the chaos of adolescence, emotional scars, and the cautious beginnings of love, where the character Mafuyu stands in front of a microphone with his guitar. He's stiff, silent, seemingly unsure, but when he opens his mouth to sing the song he's written for his lost love, something remarkable happens. The air in the room changes. The animation doesn't flinch. The music pours out like a confession, raw, trembling, and beautiful. That moment isn't just a turning point in the show. It's a turning point for boys' love storytelling in anime. This is not just another high school romance. This is a story that trusts silence, ache, and vulnerability more than formula or spectacle. Given is, at last, a boy's love story that does not contort queerness into shame, titillation, or novelty. Instead, it tells the truth quietly, delicately, but with power. It's about grief, healing, the long road back to emotional openness, and the tentative stammer of first love. So many anime that claim to represent queer experiences reduce them to exaggerated tropes. The lascivious older man, the clueless Yuke, the assaulter's romance misstep. Given rejects all of this. There is no leering or groping here, no slapstick jokes at the expense of consent. Instead, we find characters who behave like people. Mafuyu, withdrawn and visibly scarred by the suicide of his boyfriend Yuki, is a portrait of unspoken sorrow. His pain doesn't come out in speeches, it lingers in his silence. Ritsuka, a hot-headed guitarist with a sharp tongue but a gentle soul, is drawn to Mafuyu's stillness. Their relationship develops not through declarations or cliches, but through emotional proximity. A brush of the hand, a glance held for a beat too long, a song they build together, chord by chord. It's a romance told in the language of subtlety, where the unspoken carries more weight than a monologue ever could. What makes Given so powerful is that it has the courage to slow down. The show doesn't rush to please. It simmers. The animation reflects that same quiet assurance. It holds the frame, lets the moment breathe, and trusts the audience to feel instead of be told. And when the emotions do crescendo, when someone finally speaks or sings the truth, it hits like a tidal wave. I have watched too many anime that treat queer love either as comedy relief or melodramatic punishment. Shows where love between boys is framed as taboo, dangerous, or worse, laughable. Given does something far more courageous. It treats that love as normal, as gentle, as meaningful. The series has no need to raise its voice, it simply speaks from the heart. And in doing so, it earns every beat of emotional resonance. The supporting characters, Haruki, the soft-spoken bassist, and Akihiko, the complicated drummer with a past, aren't just side notes. They are their own symphony. Their relationship arc, which the series begins to explore with patience and maturity, mirrors the central couple in ways that deepen the entire narrative. Akihiko's entanglement with his ex, and Haruki's quiet yearning, are rendered with a kind of emotional depth rarely granted to supporting players in this genre. When the story expands to include them, it feels like a natural extension of the show's emotional vocabulary, not a diversion. What struck me most is how unsensational Given dares to be. Yes, there is grief. Yes, there is romance. But the show never shouts. It never tries to titillate or shock. Even its most dramatic revelations are delivered not with fireworks, but with the quiet devastation of a simple truth. It's a series about music, yes, but more than that, it's about listening. To others. To yourself. For the pain you haven't named yet. This is not a show about being gay. It is a show about being in love, being hurt, and daring to trust again. It is about forming a band not to become famous, but because music is the only way to say what words can't. And in this understated brilliance, Given becomes something rare, a sincere, intimate, and emotionally authentic boys' love story that doesn't feel like a subgenre, it feels like art. In its honesty and restraint, Given is a quiet revolution, and like all the best love stories, it lingers long after the music stops.